So, evil. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about it in relation to God. What problem is the existence of evil supposed to provide for belief in God? How exactly is this supposed to work? There are billions of people in the world who believe in God in one form or other. No one that I know seriously denies that there are also extraordinarily evil events that occur. Is everyone just confused? Well, according to some philosophers, yes, they are just confused. On one view, there's a logical incompatibility between the existence of God and the existence of any evil. We can keep it at a very high level of abstraction, that no evil could exist if God existed. Now, this has shown up in a variety of different places. A philosopher by the name of J.L. Mackie is, in contemporary times, has made a kind of argument along these lines. The thought is roughly this. If God is all good, then God will want to eliminate all the evil there is in the world. If God is all-knowing, then God will know what all the potential evil is. And if God is all-powerful, then God can eliminate all the evil. So you've got an entity that is good and therefore wants to eliminate evil, is knowledgeable and therefore isn't confused about how to eliminate evil or where it might arise, and is powerful enough to be able to eliminate all the evil in the world. So if you've got this conception of God, then it seems like that's incompatible with the existence of any evil. For how could evil arrive in a world that is ruled by such a God? God would want that evil not to exist, God would know how to have that evil not exist, and God would be powerful enough to make that evil not exist. And so this shows that there's a logical incompatibility between the existence of evil and the existence of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful deity. At first blush, the logical argument against God by way of the problem of evil seems compelling. An all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God wouldn't want there to be any evil in the world, has the knowledge of how to eliminate it, and the power to be able to. So the mere existence of any evil would seem to be incompatible with the existence of such a God. But we should think about this a little bit more carefully. Really, would any evil at all imply the non-existence of God? Are there not some goods that are conceptually, that is necessarily, connected to the existence of some evil? Take, for example, the good of a human being being able to exercise courage or charity or compassion. It seems like we can't even conceive of a world in which those virtues could be realized in a world absent of any kind of evil. In a world absent of evil, there will be no instances to be courageous or to express charity or to feel compassion towards someone. There's a conceptual link, in other words, between some suffering, some evil, and a lot of goods that can arise in response to those evils. You can't have the one without the other. If that's right, if there's some conceptual link between the attainment of some goods and what we would often call higher goods and the existence of some evil, then it can't be logically incompatible for God to exist and these evils to exist. It might be the case that these evils need to exist for these good to exist, and that God wants these goods to exist. God may not want these evils to exist, but he also wants these higher goods to be achieved, and recognizes conceptually that the evil needs to exist in order for these higher goods to exist. Now, a response to that might be, is God limited to what is conceptually possible? And the response to that is yes. It seems that most theologians and philosophers of religion do think that even God, being all-powerful, can change logical truths. 2 + 2 = 4, and God can't make it any other way. Don't ask me if God can make a rock that God then can't pick up. That's a question for another day that we won't pursue here. Have we saved the existence of God from all arguments from evil? Absolutely not. All we've done is to show that claiming that there's a strict incompatibility between the existence of God and any evil in the world is false. More interesting are arguments that suggest that given the reality of evil as it actually is here on planet Earth, in other words, it starts with an empirical claim. Look at all the evil around us, that the existence of evil as we currently suffer it here in the world, that evil is incompatible with the existence of God. And we're going to take a look at how those arguments can go now. These are often called more inductive or evidential arguments for the existence, arguments against the existence of God. Again, we're not now trying to find some kind of logical incompatibility between there being any evil in the world and God existing, but we're rather looking at the tremendous amount of suffering that occurs, senseless suffering that doesn't produce any good whatsoever. A lot of non-human animals suffer quite a bit. They suffer at our hands, but they also suffer at the hands of nature. There's a tremendous amount of suffering in virtue of natural disasters, hurricanes or tornadoes and earthquakes. There's the suffering that children often undergo who get terrible cancers. All of this suffering in the world is not responded to. There's not even an opportunity to respond to it in ways that involve charity or courage. Sometimes you can. Sometimes they happen in places or times when there's no opportunity to respond in those sorts of ways. In other words, the rampant radical evil that actually exists does not remotely or plausibly seem all necessary to exercise higher goods. A lot of it is just suffering that has no meaning to it whatsoever. Does that not seem incompatible with the existence of an all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God? That's the spirit of the inductive or the evidential argument against the existence of God. It starts with the premise that there's rampant suffering, often senseless, often happening in ways in which we are incapable of responding to it in time in the way that might bring about greater goods. And that evil seems incompatible with God's existence. A more careful way to put it is probabilistically, if we're trying to be good Bayesians. Bayes teaches us a way to update our beliefs based on evidence. Probabilistically, given all the evil I see in the world, and given that so much of it seems aimless and senseless, and there aren't opportunities to respond to it by us, then I need to figure out what is the most likely scenario. Is the most likely scenario one in which, despite all this rampant evil, there's an all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God? That's one hypothesis. Another one is that given all this evil, there isn't an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God. Does not the latter seem more probable than the former, given the kind of radical evil that pervades the history of humanity and the history of the world? So how could we respond to this? Well, some individuals will often appeal to the idea that God acts in mysterious ways, and we shouldn't lose confidence that there is some greater good that can emerge from the kind of radical evil that we see all around us. I should mention that this is not quite a response. It's more a giving up. It's more saying, well, I don't know how to reconcile all this radical evil with the existence of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God, but surely, since I already believe in this God, I have to have faith and confidence that this is somehow reconciled or resolved. That's fine as a matter of faith, but as a matter of argumentation, as a matter of philosophy, that's not a terribly compelling reason. Now, I should, in all fairness, say that the probabilistic and evidential arguments from evil to the non-existence of God are complicated. There's a lot of moves back and forth, and some extraordinarily talented philosophers on both sides of this issue have some really cool, interesting things to say about whether the evidence really does make it more likely that God doesn't exist than that God does. All the same, I'm going to just suggest, or at least point to another way that some philosophers have responded to the problem of evil. And what they've done is, rather than deny the existence of evil, as some people will do, they'll say that evil is illusory, that things only seem to be evil, or, and that doesn't seem a very promising course of action, in my opinion, or rather than appealing to God just working in mysterious ways, having a kind of confidence that it all works out at the end, rather these philosophers will say, well, maybe we ought to rethink the nature of God. And this is a good way to close up this module. We began with the conception of God as all good, all powerful, all knowing, and we can fill that in if we want, but some philosophers have taken the problem of evil so seriously as to suggest that we need to rethink our conception of the divine. Maybe God isn't all-powerful, for instance. Maybe God, while all good and all-knowing, nevertheless can't unilaterally intervene in the universe. Maybe God is in part connected to the universe and suffers with us and can lure us towards better behavior, can try to lead us towards living a better life, but in some sense can't just intervene in any given moment. For some people, this is literally sacrilege. This is a terrible conception of the divine. For other philosophers, though, maybe taking a step back from God being all-powerful and just instead being kind of maximally powerful meaning simply that God has the most power that is achievable, but not all powerful, not the sort of being that can do anything save logical contradictions, is the way to go. Again, that's not something that we're going to pursue here. I will simply say, though, that when you go into many fictional accounts of God, there have been many storytellers, some who show up in superhero stories and some don't, who try to portray God in a somewhat more modest form in order to make sense of the idea that there's such rampant evil out there in the world. In this sense, once you start taking God away from being the classical conception of God, the classical theistic conception of God, God becomes more of a kind of being that we start recognizing with some of the most extremely powerful beings that we see show up in comic book stories. So whether that comes at too high of a cost, removing some of the essential nature of God as traditionally conceived in order to respond to things like the problem of evil, that's a hard question to answer. That's something that only individuals can answer for themselves. For me, I think that it's not altogether inappropriate to think that maybe we started off in the wrong way, thinking that God had all these attributes, if we're going to take seriously the problem of evil in the world. And so I think that we should conclude this module just by pointing out that we haven't talked much about superheroes here, but that's because God, understood classically, doesn't show up in a lot of superhero stories, and it'd be really weird for superheroes to fight God or confront God. If God really is all-powerful, then God couldn't destroy all comic book universes merely with a single thought. But all the same, when thinking about the power of superheroes, when thinking about superheroes' place in cultures as a kind of mythological, godlike thing, this does invite a conversation about God, about God's nature, about whether God exists or not. And we've been looking at some classic arguments for and against the existence of God. It's a good place to stop and to have you spend some more time on your own thinking about these deep and profound matters.